Perfect. Hi, Kendall. How are you doing?
I'm doing well.
Fantastic. My name is Asger Lindholdt, and I have the big privilege and honor to have a chat with you, Kendall. I'm a big fan of your work. I've seen some of your videos on YouTube, and I'm currently reading your fantastic book, Story Smart. And I really see you as the expert actually on this planet on storytelling and science and how they merge together. And it's quite incredible the work you've done throughout several decades. So it's going to be really interesting to dig into why we should tell more stories and how to do it. But before we get started, I just kind of want to get the audience to know you a little bit because you have a very interesting background within science and storytelling. Could you maybe share a little bit of your personal story and how you went from being an expert at NASA to a scientific storyteller?
Well, I was leading a small research team at Lawrence Berkeley Lab, one of the national research labs. My doctorate is in oceanography, which has absolutely nothing to do with storytelling. And so our assignment was to look at the environmental implications of advanced oceanic energy technologies. Moderately interesting. But at that time, this was in early 1980s, well, 80, 81, 82 in there. I began to woo a woman who now has been my wife for almost 40 years. And in order to get woo points with her, I took her sister, a single mom, had a 4-year-old boy, then turned 5, so 4 or 5-year-old boy. I would take him to the park a lot to, give his mom a break. And trial and error, I found the only way I could get him to slow down, which is something I was supposed to periodically do. Food didn't work. Saying that I wanted to sit down and rest didn't work. But if I said, let's flop into the sandbox here in the park and I'll tell you a story, he would flop into the sandbox, sit down and say, okay, get going. Let's have a story. So I started to just make up stories purely sort of for self-defense so I could get him to slow down a little bit in these visits to the park. We started to draw crowds. This is pre-cell phone. So the assumption was if someone was talking, they were actually talking to the people physically around them in the park. And it's not so much children, but I expected them to come over. Sure. But adults would wander in. And I started to watch the adults. They'd come in, and there was no guarantee the story was going anywhere. I was making it up as I went along.
Sure.
Even if it was going somewhere, most of them came in the middle and wouldn't know where it was going or why. But I started to watch the adults and started to watch adults walking by the park, 3-piece suits, polished shoes, carrying briefcases, obviously going important business places. And you could see them slow down and lean in toward the park, almost like I was a gravity well, pulling them into the circle around this story. And I one day it hit me that they weren't there because someone was talking in the park. People do that all the time. They were there because they perceived that it was a story, and they listened to stories differently than they listen to other kinds of material. Well, now I can show it to you in an EEG lab. Whole different aspects of your brain light up when you perceive that what you're listening to is in story form. We listen to stories differently than we listen to other material. So once I realized that, I became fascinated with, and then in awe of, and then in love with the power of story. We couldn't get the very people that paid us in the federal government, the very people that paid us to do research, we couldn't get them to read our reports. But yet if I started to tell a story, people would stop whatever they were doing and come and listen. That there was something about this thing we called story that was incredibly powerful. So I dropped out, became a storyteller. And because I was the first storyteller in the US, working storyteller to come into storytelling with a background in science, I instantly got dubbed as the person to do all the research to answer. We had no budget for research, but still, the question was that we wanted to answer is, why do people listen to stories? Why do they remember stories? Why do we bother to pour time and an amazing amount of mental energy into a story when we don't do it to other kinds of information that come and go all the time around us?
Yeah, so it's like you say, stories are very powerful. Your experience with the kid, and I've seen it in my own kindergarten. I have a 5-year-old, and sometimes one of the adults there, he tells stories, and I'm like, he has 20 kids just completely quiet and listening. It's so powerful, that tool. And in today's world, in the more professional setting, it's hard to have people, like you say, read more than a page. Then people become abstracted with other things. And so that's why stories could be very powerful.
They say that all the time, and yet, we routinely take time to listen to stories. And there's the bottom line of the research is the reason why we do that is because of the way our brains are physically wired. There are, and the predominant theory is that because we started using stories about 150,000 years ago, that our brains are now evolutionarily hardwired for it. It could be that our brains were always wired that way, and that's why we gravitated towards stories. It really doesn't matter. The truth is, we're hardwired to make sense of the world in story terms. We can see that neural net when we start in doing experiments in the lab, EEG, fMRI labs. When we isolate specific story bits of information, we can see specific subregions in the brain light up, and thereby start to piece together what that neural story network looks like, where it is, how it operates. And it's what we're finding is that because the brain is hardwired to make sense of the world and to create meaning from what we see in story terms, that it's not so much that it's important to tell stories. It's really important to recognize that your audience, whoever they are going to make sense out of and create meaning from your information in specific story terms. And they don't do it at a conscious level. It's done at an automatic, subconscious level. So if you understand those story terms that their subconscious minds are using to make sense of that initial information, you can take advantage of that to have a much greater probability of having the information you want to get across accurately and powerfully into their minds, conscious minds and memories.
Yeah, you have a couple of good examples in your book, Story Smart, right, where you actually exemplify how we make everything into a story. Some quite nice examples, which people can read in your book. So like you're saying, basically we make everything into a story, so we might as well tell it in the story format. And one of your great points was, I've always thought of stories as a life experience, but it's more how we package the information, how we tell it, like the structure to it.
I was just doing some, I've done a couple of programs recently for various parts of the military here in the U.S., Army and Navy groups. And of course, they want everything in sort of military-related images so they can understand it. And think of it this way. If you want to tell a story just for entertainment,
sure,
that's fine. But let's say that they're actually, within a business sense, professional sense, there's always a point to your story. Now, I would argue there always is a point to the story, but there's some message you're trying to get across, some thought, some takeaway message that is the reason why you're taking time and effort to communicate.
Definitely.
Story isn't the message.
No.
Story is the vehicle that carries the message. So when I'm talking to the military, I said, picture the message like the warhead of a missile.
Mm.
What you want to deliver to the story is the missile itself that carries and delivers. It's the delivery vehicle for it, which can accurately deliver it. If you mess up with the story, it's like having your missile, suddenly go 5,000 miles off course, and you don't have any effect at all. You've got to have the message that you want to get across, but then you design the story as the vehicle that carries that message specifically into the conscious mind and memory of your target audience. The reason we've always thought of communication as controlling. What do I say? What do I write? That is, we sort of take responsibility for what comes out of our mouths and out of our fingers on a keyboard.
Sure.
What we're finding now is that is a very ineffective and inadequate version of your responsibility as a communicator.
The written part, you're saying?
What you're taking responsibility for then is what first reaches the sensory organs of your audience, eyes or ears.
Yeah.
What reaches the conscious mind is substantially different from what reached the sensory organs, although we don't think of that's true, because all that processing happens subconsciously. For example, when you're reading, what really goes down your optic nerve isn't words and letters. It's a dot pattern. It's like the old TV screens that had what kind of a gun was it? It wasn't a radon gun, but a gun that shot little dots at a screen and would go back and forth, back and forth, back real quickly. So if you're on the other side of the screen, to you it looked like there was motion, like there was actually physical motion. Really, it's just a dot pattern. What goes down your optic nerve is like that dot pattern. And a whole group of centers down the lower subconscious part of your mind, or back part of your mind, take that dot pattern and put it back together to form lines. And other little subregions say, oh, I recognize that line. That's a number. That's a letter. That's a symbol. Other ones look at it and say, oh, there are a whole bunch of these grouped together. That forms what I call a word. And run over to the dictionary, your internal mental dictionary, say, oh, I recognize that word, and start to put words together in sentences. That's what gets up to your conscious mind. You're not even aware of all that processing. Well, at the same time, what other processing that's happening is putting those words and sentences into internal story form to make it make sense to you. If I said, John felt lonely, he walked next to the neighbor's doorbell. Instantly, everyone says, oh, I know why I rang the doorbell. It's because he was lonely. Start to do a cause and effect thing. That's not true at all.
No.
But that's the way we make it make sense, by putting it in story form. If you know all the terms that the receiver is going to use automatically, subconsciously, to create sense out of something, you can be sure to include that relevant information into what you provide, so that they make sense out of it the way you intended for them to.
Yeah. So
the elements of story form then become a map. The elements of effective story form actually form a map of the initial internal processing of the human brain. What you're saying is, here's what the brain is going to do. So I'll provide this information to the brain of my receiver so it makes sense of the world the way I want them to. Yeah. And that really is what we call effective story form. It's just mirroring what happens inside the brain, the way the brain is wired to make sense of the world.
And that's why I think your take on it is so interesting, because you really dive into what triggers in the brain. So then when we dive into the system you also describe in the book, then we have a much higher chance of really hitting those spots. So they do remember, and hopefully will take some action.
Well, and more importantly, remember what you wanted them to.
Sure.
Action the way you wanted them to.
Yes.
And so what it gets into is controlling how your audience responds to information. I was at a movie, this is about 4 years ago, with my wife, and I've even forgotten which movie it was. Maybe it was 5 years ago. And we went with some friends of my mother-in-law. So they were old. She was in her late 80s, maybe even 90 at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And in one of the opening scenes of a movie, one woman was on who was not a major character in the movie, but this friend of my mother-in-law's said, I used to have that exact same dress.
Mm-hmm.
And for the rest of the movie, because she linked with and started to then identify with that character because of, in this case, a dress, she didn't care about anybody else in the movie. She looked at the whole movie through the eyes of this side character. That sort of thing happens all the time, and knowing what triggers it and how to control the way that your audience views the characters and the situations and the elements in it that you present gives you a better chance of having them not get sidetracked on someone and something that to you was, if not totally immaterial, at least tangential to the main point of your story.
Yeah. One question I want to ask you is that, I mean, you don't have to spend a lot of time on YouTube or many books on public speaking where they say storytelling is important, but why do you think it is such a rare part of a large part of business presentations then, when we know that it's quite important to have some stories? If you agree with my point.
I do, and it's something that I ponder a lot.
Yeah.
I can track this back through some other people's work. I haven't done a lot of this research myself. To England in about slightly after the dawn of the Renaissance.
Yeah.
When the scientific revolution was just beginning. And partly it is driven by a flaw in the English language. We learn a lot by setting up paradigms of opposites. Black, white. Okay, hot, cold. At some point, and I don't think this happened consciously, but it seems to track back to somewhere starting in England, and then so we're talking late 1500s. Somehow that sort of a paradigm was set up with story. And here's the problem with English. There is no opposite for story. We don't have a word for not story.
No.
And so what happened was surrogates were used. Truth versus lie. Fiction versus nonfiction. And story somehow got linked to lies and to fiction.
All right.
I have no idea why or how, but somehow the word story got linked to that side of this truth, lie, fiction, nonfiction paradigm. Although we tell true stories all the time.
Sure.
But somehow the word story got a very bad reputation as representing something that you go to if you're trying to put a spin on the world and you don't have any facts, then you make up a good story. There are a couple of those kinds of cultural myths around story, and they are cultural. They don't exist everywhere in the world.
All right.
But they dominate Western thinking. And so what I find is that by approaching the word story not as from the side of art and of performance art, or as from that side, but approaching it from the world of science. Well, here's what we know about the brain, and this is neuroscience. And then all of a sudden people are open to pondering the value of something that they would have otherwise thought was fairly frivolous. So it's a real oddity. Every human being tells stories every day.
Yeah.
Every human being has a brain that is hardwired, I mean, literally, physically hardwired, set up with neural nets that process incoming information in story form. Every one of us. Partly it's because, so that part of it is those kind of cultural myths. Part of it is that since the time you were a year and a half, 2 years old, and just beginning to get a vocabulary, what you figured out is that if you put your wants and needs in story form, you're more likely to get those wants and needs filled.
Yeah.
So we tell stories automatically. It's like a lot of other things that you do. Your conscious mind is the slowest processor in your brain. There's several other processors that are 1,000 times faster. So anything that you do regularly, you get out of your conscious mind and put in those automatic processors.
Yeah.
Okay, now some of that is, like running your heart and running the internal systems. You're not consciously aware of those at all. But a lot of it is things that you do repeatedly. You know how to tie a pair of shoelaces, right? But I guarantee you could not write down on a piece of paper in temporal sequential order what you do with each thumb and finger when you tie a pair of shoelaces.
I couldn't. I mean, it just happens subconsciously.
You just automatically do it.
Yeah.
Because you do that so regularly, you've housed that information in a subconscious processor, so you don't consciously have to think about it. Well, but you can tie shoelaces. All I have to do is look down at your shoe.
Sure.
Say, I can do that.
Yeah.
We tell our stories the same way. From the time you were a young child, because you did it so regularly, the techniques and the way that you approach storytelling, you dumped into a subconscious processor. A lot of times I'll do workshops where for me, the goal of the workshop is to show people how good they are at storytelling.
Yeah, because like you said, we're hardwired to understand things through stories, so we're probably also very good to tell stories.
The problem is,
like, the higher you go in the academic world, the less story seems to be applied and used.
Yeah.
Like you say, there's this myth about it's a way to cheat people somehow by telling stories. Is that right? In your experience?
Oh, absolutely, but it's pure myth.
Yeah, I agree. And it's boring when there are no stories.
The thing is, those very people who say, oh, no, I don't tell stories, do tell stories.
Oh, yeah.
But because they don't do it consciously, they lose control of their stories, and so those stories aren't as consistently effective as they should be. So it's partly a process of, the cool part about storytelling is, to become a consistently effective storyteller, you don't have to learn anything new. You already know it all. You just know it consciously. So it's a process of becoming consciously aware of what you've spent a lifetime perfecting and dumping into other processors in your brain. All right.
Good. I mean, and you've done actually some very interesting research on the brain, and you identified some particular areas in the brain. One thing you talk about is the make sense mandate and the neural story net. Can you maybe talk a little bit about that, what that is, and what you found out about that particular part of the brain?
Now, make sense mandate certainly is not something that, in that term, that's my name.
Okay.
The concept came from developmental psychologists, starting back in the 70s, who were looking at why we hold on to certain bits of information, why we and others go in effectively in one ear and out the other. And one of the concepts was, if it doesn't make sense to you, sensory inputs,
sure,
you tend to ignore them. And so what that means is that if there's sensory inputs coming in, there's some effort made inside your brain at a subconscious level to figure it out and make it make sense.
Yeah.
This is what makes magic work. All magic tricks are your brain taking something and making it make sense to you, because what you're seeing isn't what you expected to see. So you use then magic as the answer for why it works the way it works. So it's all illusion in that sense. What we're finding is that narrative-related experience or information that our brains are hardwired to make sense of incoming narrative or experiential information in those specific story terms. And that mandate to make it make sense allows the brain to infer, to imply, to ignore part of the information and hold on to other parts, or completely radically change information in order to make it make sense. And it's easy to demo, and there are a couple
Yeah,
of
I remember one example when I lived in Italy and I was learning Italian, and a lot of the times I wouldn't understand, or and at a certain point I started understanding the language, but then as I started learning more, there were certain words I learned, and then I would hear them all the time. And before that, I never heard them. I really honestly believe I've never heard that word, and then I learned it and just kept hearing it over and over again. So I think that's a good example maybe of us neglecting information we receive.
Yes, we'll neglect some, we'll change some, we'll infer a lot. If I said, what did I say before? John felt lonely. He walked next door and rang the doorbell. You hear that, and we could go through about 8 different assumptions you just made in order to make that make sense.
Yeah.
None of them are true, but they just make sense to you. They're based on your past experiences. Definitely. If I said, person number 1 says, "Hi, John," and person number 2 says, "Shh, I'm not really here. You never saw me."
Yeah, we start making
us how to make sense out of that. What we assume is that person number 2 is really saying, "Keep it quiet. I don't want other people to know that I'm here."
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
That's not what he said.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we take the thing that is most likely.
To make sense out of it, you had 2 choices. Take it literally, in which case you're assuming that person number 2 really isn't here. He's somewhere else, and somehow is there it's a projection of number 2. It's a holographic projection that somehow is being projected, beamed into the room. Or you say more commonly, no, that doesn't make sense to me. So I'll take everything person number 2 said and completely reverse the meaning of every one of those sentences. We do that all the time. It's just amazing to see how often this happens a lot in companies.
Yeah.
The CEO will stand up and say, "This is what we're going to do, and it's going to be great for all of us." And what everyone hears is, "Oh no, this is going to be terrible for me." Because in order to make it make sense at their level, they'll completely reverse the meaning of what they've heard.
Yeah.
And that's part of the receiver trying to put that into story form that makes sense to them.
Yeah.
That's where understanding story structure really becomes a powerful controller of communication.
Yeah, a good thing or a good example is comedians that uses, I think, the story structure all the time, which is they set up a pattern and we kind of guess what's going to happen, and that they break it to something that is unlikely. And that's actually the funny part. So I think they use it a lot consciously.
In fact, most comedians would, if the audience doesn't take a little bit of information and project it into a story form, most comedy falls flat. Yeah. It requires the audience to be creating those stories so that then they can say something that violates the structure, the story structure you were anticipating, as you said. Yeah. And that is a big tool, one of the biggest tools for comedy, that and just straight exaggeration. Of course. So they exaggerate more than you expected them to. Yeah.
Would you say that there are some times when we can tell too many stories, or are there certain situations in a business setting where you think, all right, let's just get the information? Sure. What kind of examples could that be?
Let's see. I mean, a story is the delivery vehicle for some point.
Yeah.
And what people expect is for that delivery vehicle to go pretty directly to make its point. A business story that lasts more than 2 minutes had better, let's say it this way, the importance of the point that a story is making is proportional to the length, the allowable length of the story before the audience says this story is no longer worth my time and effort.
All right.
Whenever sit in the back of any classroom and listen how many times in the course of a day a teacher says, class, pay attention. Class, pay attention. Think of it in economic terms. You're asking those students to pay with a very precious resource their attention for something you're trying to sell. Okay? Take that now in a business story sense. You're asking your audience to pay with their time and attention for something that you're trying to sell, an idea.
Yes.
And the audiences always, although they don't do it consciously, are always evaluating, is this still worth my time and attention? Am I still getting my value out of what I'm paying with? I'm paying with my attention. I'm paying by being engaged, using mental energy and time to focus on the imagery, create imagery in my head around this. Is it worth my time? So for a business sense, it's not that you can say, oh, a 3-minute story is too long. Don't ever do a 5-minute story.
All right.
It's a question of doing the economics to say, is it really worth my audience's time and worth their attention? Will they be able to perceive that it's worth their time and attention to focus on this material for this length of time?
But that's a good point. I mean,
that's the way I can get it across. So it's really just cost-benefit analysis that you're doing with the story.
Yeah, good point. So basically, it's spend more time on the more important aspects or points that you're making, and shorter time on the less important points.
Right.
Yeah.
And often a story that lasts, 4 or 5 minutes in a presentation, which is pretty long for most business stories, should be one that then over time regularly will come back into the rest of that presentation, or over time, say within a company, so that it becomes a recurring theme. And in order to then establish those themes, that's a much more important concept to drive home. So you could get away with a more complex, therefore longer, more detailed story to set it up.
But it maybe, as you said, as a reference point, like 2, maximum 3 minutes.
Usually, it's rare that you can't create the situation and the imagery and the characters and make a point within a couple of minutes for a business story. It's not that there aren't exceptions to that, but it's fairly rare. And usually what you do is a couple of minute story that creates context, that creates perspective, and then you go into the statistics and you go into the numbers, and then come back out of that to another story that sets up and provides perspective for then another set of factual presentation.
So you would typically tell a story before you start digging into the facts? Would that be a good
usually structure? And what the story does is gather everyone's mind to look at those facts from a specific viewpoint. So what you're doing is then using the story to frame the concept. And then using the facts to back up the concept and to exemplify it. But the facts then don't have the same power if you haven't already established the concept.
Yeah. So that's also often what I say to the people I train, that you have to go through the heart to get to the brain. I mean, you have to have that emotional part before you really want to engage in the specific numbers, and they become much more interesting after the story.
That's something that we were able to show in the lab, is that human beings are never fully engaged by information alone.
Yeah.
Never. There has to be an emotional component to engagement.
Yeah.
To have people really fully engaged, there has to be an emotional component. Somehow you have to make it visceral. You have to make it personal. You have to somehow let that audience member feel that they are part of the story. The story is part of them. So that you need that emotional context, an emotional element, or you'll never fully engage an audience. If you don't fully engage them, there's a real cap on the amount of influence that you can exert over that audience. That is, say, change attitudes, beliefs, values, behavior.
Sure.
And so what stories do is create that emotional involvement. So stories do a couple of things really well. One, they are phenomenal at creating that emotional involvement, making the story feel personal, so I can visualize the story as if I were in it. That's what stories do. They are great at then communicating concepts, which they're much better. In fact, fiction stories are much better at communicating concepts than are nonfiction stories.
All right.
Business people tend to be very reticent to use a purely fiction story. And yet, if you can define a concept that you want to get across, you can do it faster and more powerfully by making up purely fictional characters. I mean, they could be rabbits, they could be tree stumps. I don't care what they are.
Yeah.
Because as soon as you talk about real people and do nonfiction stories, everyone wants to know about the people.
Yeah.
John was a plant manager at our Phoenix plant. Oh, really? What years was he there? Does he have a family? What was his wife? Where did his kids go to school? How long was he there? Where did he live? Well, that has nothing to do with the story, right? When you get to real people, the minds of the audience diverge on all those little side points that revolve around the character. If I said once there was a plant manager of a manufacturing facility, well, no one says, "Oh, is he married?" I often do a story to make the point. Stories that stories actually get results, and it's about a cab driver and a New York Catholic priest.
Sure.
Well, no one thinks, is the cab driver married? Does he have any kids? Does he live in the city? Does he live over in Brooklyn? Does he commute to work? No one ever thinks that because it's obviously a fictional character.
Yeah.
So that in that sense, fiction stories have the ability to more quickly engage an audience to search for a concept. So what's the point? What are we talking about here? And to absorb the concept much more powerfully, and then you go into nonfiction examples.
That's a really good point.
Into the stats that back up whatever concept you wanted to produce, and it's a great back and forth.
That's a really good point.
You control the communication that you're doing during a presentation.
Wow, I've never thought about that. That nonfiction or fictional characters can have an advantage because you then don't think about all the other parts that might be irrelevant.
And so what you do, in fact, you even set aside the characters and you look for what's the point of the story.
Yeah, and that's what you want to do, obviously, in the business presentation.
In that way, so that way you can develop the story much faster. I mean, so that in 90 seconds you can typically 90 seconds you can have the story done and your point made, and then use that point with nonfiction examples.
Yeah, that's good because then you have understood the concept and you can then see how it applies to the real world. Yeah, very interesting. In your book and some of your YouTube videos, you talk about how to tell stories that impact. It's like you kind of have to go through all of these elements to create a strong story. Could you talk a little bit about some of the key elements in a strong story? So for the audience that are then thinking about telling a story in a business context, can be like, yeah, I kind of got that part, I got that part.
Yeah.
Like,
let me divide it into two halves.
all right.
And around those two questions, how does the human brain automatically make sense of incoming information?
Yeah.
And then how do we create meaning from it?
Yeah.
What happens is that first you make sense of it. And then if you're going to create some meaning from this, it's going to be from your self-created version of whatever got into your head that you automatically created to make it make sense.
Yeah.
All right. But what you're after is the sense making, or I mean, the meaning making.
Yeah.
For the sense making part, sense making is that's how we control engagement. That's how we get people to pay with their attention to the story. And that's, if I were to define it, an effective story is watching characters that we find to be of interest to us.
All right.
Struggling, facing risks and dangers to overcome problems and conflicts to reach a goal that is important to them. All told in sufficient details, sensory details, so that we can visualize it in our minds. We can see it.
Yeah.
That's it. So we have characters, and there are a couple of key character positions, it turns out. But right now, characters, then the information about the characters that makes them be of interest to us. We don't have to like them.
No.
We just have to care about them enough so we'll remember who they are for the duration of the story.
Yeah.
Often that's title, position.
Okay.
A lot of it is like an attitudinal trait. What kind of is he a gruff, a gruff manager? Is he arrogant? Is he that kind of some aspect of a personality trait?
Yeah.
Traits. Then we need a goal. What a character is after. It's not what they do, it's what they're after.
Yeah, all right.
What drives them. Then we need to know why that's important to them. That's motive. Motive, as it turns out, the more we research it, the more powerful and important motive is. It's always been grossly underrated.
Yeah.
Motive is what makes you identify with some other character. Motive is what is the values, the attitudes, the personal, cultural, community values that drive you, that make you want the things you want. Goals have to be physical and tangible, something that you're after. Not so with goals. That can be belief in family. That can be self-sacrifice, personal loyalty. That group. Okay. Then we need problems and conflicts. Yeah. Those are things that keep a character from reaching a goal.
Yeah.
John wanted to be president of the company. The board elected him president, and he was president. Well, who cares? That's a story. It's only going to be a story. We're only going to care about it if John wants to be president of the company, but there are some obstacles that stand in his way.
Yeah.
A lot of companies, for some reason, are reticent to talk about problems and conflicts. They're almost like they feel like those are failures.
Yeah.
But if you didn't have any problems and conflicts, you wouldn't need to hire employees.
No.
You wouldn't need to go to work every day.
No.
You go to work to do important things. You always have problems that need to be overcome.
I mean, that's what we're paid for, to solve problems.
And it's not really the problems and conflicts themselves that we care about. They have to be there.
Yeah.
But what we care about is the risk and danger that they create for a character. The likelihood that something's going to go wrong. The probability of failure.
Yes.
The higher it is, the more we care. If you're willing to do something with a 1% probability of success, we want to find out where everyone wants to know, did they get, if you have a 95% probability of success, mostly we don't care. We're on to something else.
Yeah.
So you get no credit for doing something if it was a certainty that you were going to be able to do it. if it's a near impossibility and you do it, or if it was a really difficult thing to do and you do it, you get amazing amounts of credit. Even if you are attempting to do it, you get amazing amounts of credit from an audience. They begin to empathize with and sympathize with those characters. And what we find in the lab is as soon as you start to identify with and empathize with a character, without even knowing it, you start to adopt some of their values and viewpoints.
Wow.
So that stories about those struggles, about facing the risk and danger, are the greatest tool you have to exert influence over an audience. As they change attitudes, beliefs, values, and behaviors. So risk and danger, that's the consequences of failure. What would happen if something goes wrong? Not saying that it's going that it's going to happen, but what would it be? The greater the danger, the greater the risk, the greater the excitement in the story, the greater the tension in the story. And as the saying goes, as goes tension, so goes attention. So that the reminding us of what could go wrong, instead of being something you want to hide under the carpet, is in fact something you should want to trumpet, because it controls the engagement level of the audience. And then what we want to watch aren't characters wandering around doing random things. We want to watch characters struggle to get to a goal, facing risk and danger, to overcome problems and conflicts, to get to the goal that's important to them. Those are the elements.
Yeah, these are basically the elements. So it's kind of like
those are the ones.
Checklist.
And because those are the ones that the brain is automatically hardwired to use to interpret and make sense out of incoming information.
Yeah, and in the book I'm just reading by you right now, you mentioned motives, and I think personally I probably didn't pay that much attention to that earlier, but now I will because of reading your book. You have an example in your book. I think it's a kid that has to, it's a fictional example, he has to go get some milk, and that's not really that interesting, but then you talk about the motive behind it because they couldn't save his mother, I think. Like made up story. I'm like, yeah, now it's interesting.
If you identify with the motives of a character, you will always start to identify with the character. And therefore you'll look at the story through the eyes of that character, empathizing with that character. And the more we research it, the more we find that motives are the primary tool that people use to decide whether they identify with a character or not. If you are one of us, or you're one of them. It's all those are determined by with our assessment of motives. Now the trouble is, most people in their stories, it's especially true in business stories, don't talk about motives. They talk about what we do, what we want to do. So make it in goals, but don't talk about what's behind it. And there's always more than just profit for the company, profit for the shareholders. It's behind it there. And the more you look at what are the drivers, what are the values, the motives that drive my target audience, whoever it is I really want to communicate with. And of those, which ones do we hold in common? Which ones really relate to the story that I want to tell? If you use those, bring those out, those motives out in the way you tell the story, you automatically enlist that target audience in supporting the story. It's just phenomenal how well it works. All the time that someone is talking, we're always at a semi-conscious level saying, why are they saying that?
We're always trying to scan.
What are they really after? That's all looking for motive. Here's what we find in the lab that I think it just blew my mind. If you don't specify motive, don't actually overtly tell it in the story, everyone still infers motives, but consistently, and this may be cultural because I haven't tested it, I haven't done any experiments outside of the US on this one,
All right.
So it may be sort of Western thinking, but everyone consistently assumes motives that are more self-serving, narcissistic, even cruel than are the actual motives a character behind it that drive a character's behavior. I don't know why they do that, but they always assume motives that are much more negative.
All right. Mm.
Oh yeah, he's in that for himself. Hey, what's in it for him? Yeah, he wants, sure, the CEO wants to put that in because he's going to get $10 million deal out of it. What's in it for me? Nothing. We always assume motives that wind up being very self-serving and condescending. And that automatically flips the target audience, instead of empathizing with a character, against them.
Yeah.
And we see it happen all the time. Very consistent. And then the person who's telling the story doesn't understand at all why the story didn't come across well.
Yeah.
They didn't specify motives, and people assumed a set of motives for the character they described, themselves or other characters, that are much more negative than were intended.
Yeah. So basically, we have to tell what are the motives, so we ensure that the audience will perceive them as positive. I don't know if it has to do with the brain, how we are wired to primarily look for danger before pleasure.
It may be. It may be. I'm not sure.
Because
I'm not sure. It may be partly cultural.
Okay.
I don't know. Yeah, it's we haven't. I haven't certainly gone to look at that yet. Mm-hmm. But it's there, and it explains so many of the instances where a story falls flat with a target audience and it winds up being counterproductive instead of productive.
Good point. So include motives, that's essential in a story, and those elements you just talked about, characters, their traits, risk and danger. So kind of look for that, and that's going to be a strong story. How can people then practice storytelling? Because you always hear about tell stories, and now you're giving a great bunch of tips on how to do it, but how can people then train and become better, do you think? What could be a good way to
at the telling of the story?
Telling stories. Could that be everyday stories, or should it be in business context if that's what you're looking for?
That's the way we naturally go about learning and telling stories. And every story that you tell, we all have our little sets of stories that have happened in your life, that you're meeting new people and you're sort of going back and forth, and here's some of my stories, here's some of your stories. That's the way we meet. That's the way we get to know people, right? Think about how you learn those stories. Now, a lot of people say, well, I didn't learn it. It happened to me.
Yeah.
You still had to learn it. You had to take a set of experiences and turn them into a very specific sequence of mental images linked with emotions, linked with some vocabulary that you filed away into memory in such a way so that you could readily recall them back out of memory. And reform images in your mind that would drive both the way you tell the story and also the words that you say. You had to learn this. You had to learn it. All right. So there are two things that people run into trouble with. One is the way they learn stories. The way typically we learn a story for business is contrary to the way we naturally learn stories, so that we then can't tell them the way we naturally tell stories. And the way we practice is contrary to the way that we, over the course of our lives, naturally tell stories. Basic tenet of storytelling: don't learn it in order to tell it.
Okay.
Tell it in order to learn it.
Yeah, so just tell more stories.
Something happens to you, and you tell the story to someone, and it sort of comes out, and it's a little halting, and you jump around a little bit, and then you tell it to someone else. About the third or fourth time you tell it, it starts to get pretty smooth.
Yeah.
That's the way you naturally learn stories. You tell them, and although consciously you don't notice it, you're absorbing some very detailed feedback from your audience about what worked, what didn't work, and then you're restructuring the story and you tell it again. Over 3 or 4 tellings, you start to settle in on something, a set of images, a pacing, progression that works pretty well for you. So many people try to memorize it and tell it. Memorizing, unless you can say this honestly happened to you. If something really amazing happens to you and you run home, you say, family, gather around. This is the most amazing thing. I've got to tell you about it. You're going to love this story. Sit down. No, wait. First, I'm going to go up to my room. I'm going to write it down, memorize the words. Then I'll come down and tell it to you.
Yeah, it's not going to happen.
If you do that, then you memorize. Otherwise, don't do it. It makes it impossible for you to use your natural storytelling style.
Yeah.
Now, the other thing, how you learn a story. Something happens to you. What do you learn? What is it that you file away into memory? 2 things. One is sensory images.
Yeah.
What it looked like, sound like, smell like, it's basic sensory imagery,
Sure.
right? The more detailed it is, those images are, the more likely you are to be able to recall them later. And the second thing you remember is how you felt when it happened.
Yeah.
And it is that emotional memory that drives the way you tell the story, what you do with your hands, your face, your voice, body. Okay? Usually with a business story, you never stop to think about how would I feel, how did I feel when this happened? How would I feel if this had happened to me? So we don't create even a pseudo emotional memory, which means that at the time you're telling, when your body is saying, all right, I'm used to getting certain kind of direction here for how I say it, and which comes from an emotional memory. When you don't have an emotional memory, what you use is the way you're feeling at that moment as a surrogate, which often is a little bit uncomfortable, nervous. And so that's the way you tell the story, and it doesn't match at all with what's going on in the story, and it looks to the audience like you're bored. Learn the way you naturally learn. Turn the events of a story that you want to tell into sensory images. If you were there, what would it look like? What would it smell like? What would it sound like? If you can see it in your mind, and then those are the things you want to file into memory, those sequential sensory images. And then ask yourself, if this were happening around me, how would I feel? How would I feel? Would I feel bored? Would I feel happy? Would I, angry? What would it? If you want to write something down, write that down. And then start telling the story. Tell it to the wall. Tell it to your dog. Tell it to your spouse. Tell it to the carpool if you're in a carpool. And tell the story. And every time you tell it, stop and say, did I, which are the parts that I really stumbled on? Were there parts that I forgot? The parts that you skipped over and forgot, or that you stumbled on, what you're telling yourself is that the mental imagery you have for those scenes is insufficient. Yeah. You go back and think about those scenes and say, okay, let me think a little more detail about that. What would it look like? How big is it? What, picture that scene in more detail, and you'll find that then you won't be forgetting that part next time you tell it. And that actually becomes a far more efficient, but time efficient and energy efficient way to pick up and learn a story than trying to sit at your desk and memorize it and close your eyes and see if you can tell it inside your head. You've got to tell it out loud to be able to hear it and see what really works and what doesn't work.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's one of the ways I do it as well. And sometimes I would go for a walk simply just to be more natural and start being less in the head, more in the body, more in its natural flow. So when I can walk my entire presentation, I feel pretty good about it. So that's the way I do it. And it's a great way to think about it. Memorize your own story through the storytelling. And if you're struggling, then you need those images yourself.
And to just flat memorize a string of words, because that's not what we naturally do.
No.
What happens is that all of your energy, when you go to tell it, is diverted into trying to remember this string of words.
Yeah.
So there's no energy left over with which to tell the story. And so it comes across in a monotone,
yeah.
with minimal variations in pace and volume and in tone. And so the audience is so bored, they're tuned out, and it doesn't matter if you remember or not, they're not going to hear it.
Yeah, that's so true. And that's one of the things I remember when I started giving the same presentation over and over, I could relax much more because I felt confident that I would pretty much know what was going to happen, and I could interact more with the audience than rather being in the head trying just to get all the content.
So, yeah, and that's the other thing. The first couple of times you tell a story, there will be this little voice inside your head that will say, you're going to forget it. You can't do this. You're going to forget this part. Watch. Yeah. You got to quiet that voice. And the only way to quiet that voice is to have told the story a couple of times before, which is why telling it in order to learn it is so much more effective. Because by the time you've told it a few times, you know it's going to come out, as opposed to trying to learn it so that you can get up and tell it.
Yeah, that's right. And you shared a really good point on how to find the story. It's like, is there an emotional part to it? And I sometimes say to my clients, if you feel the feeling more than a day later, there you have a story. If that emotion lasts more than 24 hours, you have a story somehow.
Another good way to look at it is if you remember something, not something that happened 5 minutes ago, but from the past, if you remember it, there's a story there.
Yeah.
If there wasn't a story there, you wouldn't remember it.
No.
Think of the thousands of things that happen to you in the course of a day.
Yeah.
3 days later, you won't remember very many of them. You may remember a couple. A week later, a month later, you'll be lucky to remember the day at all.
Yeah.
Unless something really significant happened, and we measure significant actually by the density of sensory imagery that we filed into memory. The likelihood you'll remember something is directly proportional to the density of the sensory detail that you attach to that memory when you filed it into memory. And the density of sensory detail that you created for memory is proportional to the intensity of, emotional intensity of, and significance of the event. So that those that you remember are those that are over time significant, and therefore probably are the seeds for stories, because they have significance to you that's then worth building into a story to tell.
Yeah. I mean, I think we've gone through really a lot of great stuff here on why we should tell these stories and how to do it. And I mean, people can read more about your work in your books, like the book I've been talking about, Story Smart, and then you also had another book about called Story Proof, which is really goes a little bit more deeper, as I understand it, into the scientific part, what happens in the brain. I'm looking really much forward to reading that. My own background is also within science, it's engineering, so it's we have something in common here. So it's quite unique to be reading this stuff. I mean, and it's a field that's that's fairly new, like you talk about in your book. I mean, before we could only observe the body, how people reacted on the outside, and it's not always giving us an accurate picture. I mean, I've tried that in workshops where people looked bored or uninterested, and they come up to me, and that was fantastic. I've also tried the opposite.
Yeah. One of the problems is when you are totally engaged in the story, it's almost as if you're starting to live it in the story, and the way you look, which is pretty much the same way you look when you're really bored.
Yeah.
There are differences, but they're very subtle, and you almost have to be trained into how to look for those responses in an audience and how to test them.
Yeah. And I mean, most people are friendly. So, to put on maybe a little slight attitude.
Well, except anymore, what happens is people mentally tune out real quickly if they say, "Oh, this I don't need this. I have 1,000 other things to think about today." And then anymore, what you know is that they're glancing down, so they're sneaking down a look at their cell phone.
Yeah, and if you go to scientific conferences like I used to do when I did my PhD, I mean, there were so many people doing a lot of other work than listening to the speakers.
Because most of the speakers really weren't worth paying attention to.
No.
They read the article, but to listen to the talk, if they're not, it is really an economic negotiation.
Yeah.
When you want to speak, you're asking people to pay attention with their attention for you, and it's a very legitimate question for them to say, "I don't know, maybe I will, maybe I won't. What are you selling?"
Yeah.
And actually, long before they can decide if the material is worth their time, they make all those initial decisions on the way it's being told.
Yeah.
And so it is what they're always looking for is they want to know if they believe that you believe, then and only then will they begin to believe.
Yeah.
And that's your own material. So what they do to decide if you believe in your own material is to look at how much energy and passion you are projecting in whatever way is natural for you in the way you present it. And that is scored very accurately and minutely at a subconscious level by every person who's ever listening to you.
Yeah.
And if they decide that you really care about your material, then they'll go ahead and pay attention to the material.
Yeah.
But first, they got to be convinced to pay attention to the way you're delivering it.
Definitely. I mean, you can't, I often will say, you can't inspire people if you aren't inspired yourself.
Yeah, very good. Yeah.
Pretty there.
That's absolutely true.
So,
and unfortunately, it's not enough to just be inspired.
No.
They have to perceive it.
Yeah.
The audience has to perceive it.
I mean, there's more to it. So Kendall, I mean, before we kind of wrap up things, where can people find more of your work? I mean, you have some books on Amazon I highly recommend.
Right now, it's the books that that between doing, I mean, there's continuing flow of research that's going on.
Yeah.
I'm really about due to put together a third book in that series.
Yeah.
So Story Proof was the first one. Story Smart is the second one. Yeah. I'm about ready to put together a third one, which will go into the research that's been done we've been doing since 2014, 2015, in the last couple of years. And I'm not quite sure what form that'll take. Really what we're going into now is how much, to what extent can you quantitatively anticipate influence?
Okay. Wow.
So we're developing analytical algorithms and metrics for saying, at least both in an absolute and a relative sense, whether something could exert influence. So looking at alternate story structures and saying, and scoring them against each other for it to make a specific point with a specific kind of audience. And so that's real interesting. And looking at what are all the pieces of information that an audience uses to make the decisions about characters and about goals, motives. We all do.
Yeah,
we all do it automatically. And it all comes from bits of information and cues that you get from the story. And often those cues are very subtle, and so a lot of it is you take a very vague piece of information and infer from that some important bit of information, attitude by the character, relationship between characters. Well, so that the idea is usually then to look at influence, I have to do post-story interviews.
Yes. Yeah.
We'll do assess characters and assess the way they're feeling at the end of the story. Well, you don't want to do that. You want to be able to do it all ahead of time, which means what we're doing now is looking at every little clue that people use and the patterns that are those clues that they use, so that we can now get first people and then eventually computers to be able to look at stories and do that same analysis and be able to score the influence potential of something. So anyway,
that's very interesting. That's kind of exciting. When do you think that's coming out? I mean, you're fairly new, your latest books. So
yeah, there will be something on it within the next year.
You have a blog where people can follow you, or?
I should be online. I should be on Facebook. I should have a blog.
Yeah.
And the
There's a lot of things you should.
the answer is no. I never. I'm old enough, so that I was around when I learned how to do math on slide rules.
Yeah, but I mean, you have a lot of great reviews on Amazon with your books, and I mean, I highly recommend them. So I think that's just great material.
And there are, when things get taped, when I do talks and they get taped, they get dumped onto iTunes and YouTube, those kind of places.
Yeah, and there are some videos. That's why I found you on YouTube. I mean, it's just some very good talks you have there. So I mean, unless you have anything more you want to add, I think we have covered a lot, and that's good. Yeah, it's been a real pleasure, Kendall. So I mean, I look forward to keeping in touch with you, and I'm gonna update this video with some description below, where people can read the different points. So have a look in the description below if there are certain parts you're kind of looking for on this fairly long video. So it's really been a big pleasure, Kendall, and thank you for this talk.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.